The cameras clicked on, the lights of the studio bathed everything in a tense glow, and the audience settled in with that restless anticipation only live television can create. The show had promised a heated political discussion, but no one expected the opening blow to land so hard. Donald Trump, standing at the podium with that familiar smirk, leaned into his microphone and said words that immediately drew sharp gasps from the crowd. You know, most of these so-called veterans, half of them are just looking for handouts. They're not heroes, they're lucky they even made it back. The studio froze. For a split second, there was silence so deep it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then the audience erupted, boos, shocked voices, even a few angry shouts. The host tried to regain control, but it was too late. Trump had already crossed a line no one thought he would dare touch. And then, slowly, Denzel Washington leaned forward. He didn't need to raise his voice at first. He just fixed Trump with that piercing stare, the kind that could cut through arrogance like glass. "Did you just call America's veterans freeloaders?" he asked, his tone sharp, incredulous, dripping with restrained fury. The audience immediately quieted again, waiting for what they knew was about to explode. Trump waved his hand dismissively. "Don't twist my words, Denzel. You actors are good at that. But let's be real, this country spends too much coddling losers. We need strength, not sympathy." That was it. The moment the fuse truly ignited. Denzel slammed his hand on the desk in front of him, the sound echoing like a gavel. "Losers," he thundered, his voice carrying like a commander's call on a battlefield. "These men and women bled for the flag you like to wave at rallies. They buried friends in dirt you'll never touch. You stand here, with your billions and your cowardice, and dare to call them freeloaders? That makes you unfit for office. Hell, it makes you unfit to even stand in this room." The audience exploded, clapping, cheering, some rising to their feet as if Denzel had spoken on their behalf. Trump tried to speak, but the noise drowned him out. Cameras zoomed in on his face, red, tight-jawed, clearly rattled. And the host, realizing this was no longer a debate but a showdown, let the chaos play out. The first blow had landed, and the fight had only just begun. The studio was electric, the tension slicing through the air like a blade. Trump leaned back in his chair with that smug grin he always wore, waving his hand dismissively as though the outrage over his comments about veterans was just another passing storm. "They sign up, they know the risks. Some people just aren't strong enough to handle it," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. The words echoed off the studio walls, drawing gasps and furious whispers from the audience. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every sneer, every arrogant tilt of his head. Denzel, who until then had sat in a composed silence, suddenly leaned forward. His eyes blazed with fury, his jaw tight as if restraining a storm that could no longer be held back. "You didn't just insult veterans," he said, his voice deep, calm but trembling with contained rage. "You insulted every family who has buried their sons and daughters under that flag. You insulted the blood that was spilled so you could sit here and run your mouth like a spoiled king." The crowd erupted into cheers, standing in unison. Some clapped, others shouted, "Tell him, Denzel." Trump's grin faltered for the first time, the false confidence cracking like cheap glass. He straightened, his hands gripping the desk in front of him. "You don't get to lecture me on patriotism, Hollywood boy," he snapped, his voice rising to a shout. But Denzel didn't flinch. He pointed directly at Trump, his voice now booming through the studio, every syllable cutting through the noise like a hammer on steel. "You think patriotism is about parades and flags? Patriotism is about sacrifice, about putting country before self. Something you've never done a single day in your life." The studio was shaking with applause, the cameras catching Trump's reddening face. He tried to interject, but the chants of the audience drowned him out. "Denzel. Denzel. Denzel." Trump's face turned crimson, his jaw tight as he tried to reassert control. He slammed his hand against the table, the sound echoing through the studio. "I've done more for this country than you ever will," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. The economy, the jobs, the military, they owe it all to me. He gestured wildly toward the audience, trying to win them back, but his words only seemed to fuel the anger already simmering in the room. Denzel didn't raise his voice immediately. Instead, he leaned closer to the microphone, letting silence settle over the crowd until every eye and ear locked onto him. Then, with a calmness sharper than any shout, he delivered the blow. You built towers, Donald. But those towers didn't protect a single soldier on the battlefield. They didn't comfort a mother who buried her son wrapped in a flag. They didn't stop you from mocking men who bled while you hid behind privilege. The audience roared, standing to their feet, their claps echoing like thunder. Some had tears in their eyes, veterans in uniform saluted instinctively, their faces hard with pride and fury. Trump's hands trembled, but he forced another smirk, trying to mask the growing panic. You're just an actor, he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Reading lines, pretending to be something you're not. I live in the real world. That's when Denzel's composure cracked, but not in weakness. His voice rose, filled with fire that commanded the room. No, I'm not pretending. I'm speaking for every soldier who can't speak anymore because they gave their life for this nation. And the real world, Donald, is that you insulted them on live television. That's not leadership. That's betrayal. The cheers turned deafening. The studio lights seemed to vibrate under the noise, and even the cameras shook slightly as audience members stomped their feet. Trump's words were lost in the storm, his attempts to shout drowned beneath the tidal wave of applause for Denzel's truth. Trump's smirk collapsed into a scowl as he jabbed his finger toward Denzel, his voice cracking with rage. You don't know what it takes to run a country. You sit in Hollywood, you collect awards, and you lecture me? I built this nation's strength while you played pretend on a screen. His tone was venomous, but instead of drawing respect, the audience erupted in boos. A chant even started in the back rows, "Respect the vets. Respect the vets." Denzel stood tall, his eyes unflinching. He didn't need theatrics, the weight of his words carried the force of truth. You claim you built strength, he shot back, his voice slicing through the chaos. Strength isn't found in golf courses or golden elevators. Strength is carried in the backs of the men and women you mocked. It's written in their scars, their missing limbs, their folded flags. You dishonored them, Donald. And tonight, the world is watching you squirm because you can't handle being called out. The studio froze. Cameras zoomed in on Trump, who was visibly shaken, his lips trembling as he searched for a retort. But his usual bravado failed him, the weight of Denzel's accusations hung in the air like a hammer ready to strike. Then Denzel took a step closer, his voice lowering, drawing the audience into an intimate silence. Let me tell you something about leadership. Real leaders lift others higher. They don't drag heroes down to feed their ego. You turned patriotism into a punchline, and in doing so, you showed America exactly who you are, not a commander-in-chief, but a coward-in-chief. The crowd erupted. Applause thundered like a storm, chants of "Denzel. Denzel," shook the studio. Even the hosts sat speechless, stunned by the sheer electricity of the moment. Trump tried to shout back, but his voice was swallowed in the tidal wave of cheers. Denzel stood, arms at his side, breathing steady, a portrait of calm defiance in the chaos he had ignited. Trump's face reddened as he slammed his palm on the desk, his voice cracking as he barked, "You don't get to call me a coward. I'm the President of the United States. I gave orders, I took risks, I stood toe-to-toe with world leaders who would have eaten you alive." He was practically shouting into the microphone, desperate to regain dominance. But his trembling hands betrayed him. Denzel didn't flinch. He leaned forward, eyes locked on Trump like a laser. You stood toe-to-toe with no one. You hid behind deals, behind photo ops, behind carefully staged crowds. And when the moment came to show respect, to honor the men and women who bled for this country, you made a joke out of them. That's not risk, that's cowardice. A silence fell so heavy it was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Trump opened his mouth, but Denzel didn't give him the chance. He cut him off with precision, his words sharp enough to cut steel. You want to talk about risk? Try standing at Dover Air Force Base, looking into the eyes of a mother receiving her son's coffin draped in the American flag. Try explaining to her why you chose mockery over gratitude. That's risk. That's the weight of responsibility. But you wouldn't know, because you never carried it. The audience gasped, the imagery too raw, too real. Trump tried to smirk, but it faltered into something almost pitiful. The camera caught it, a man who built his empire on bravado, suddenly crumbling under the weight of truth. Then Denzel, with chilling calm, added, "You call yourself a leader? Leaders earn respect. You demanded it. Leaders sacrifice for others. You sacrificed others for yourself. Leaders give strength to the office. You tried to use the office to hide your weakness." The eruption of applause was deafening. People leapt from their seats, clapping, shouting, some even wiping tears. The studio shook as if the audience itself had turned into a jury delivering its verdict. Trump sat there, pale, gripping the desk, his silence louder than any denial he could have given. Trump's silence didn't last long. His ego wouldn't allow it. He suddenly shot up from his chair, pacing like a caged animal, pointing a trembling finger at Denzel. You think you can stand there, a Hollywood actor, and lecture me on leadership? You make movies, I make history. His voice cracked again, the desperation clinging to every word. But the audience wasn't buying it. Boos echoed through the studio, drowning his attempts to reclaim authority. For the first time in years, Trump's signature bravado sounded hollow, like a man clinging to a script no one believed in anymore. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With his hands folded calmly in front of him, he let the storm swirl and then delivered a blow so surgical it silenced even the chaos. You don't make history, Donald. You distort it. You exploit it. History is written by men and women who sacrifice everything for the ideals of this country. You turned those ideals into slogans and merch. You cashed in on their blood. The crowd froze, stunned by the weight of his words. Some clutched their mouths, others whispered, but no one dared look away. Denzel's tone was steady, controlled, but beneath it simmered decades of frustration shared by millions who had watched Trump turn politics into theater. Trump sneered, trying to gather himself. You're grandstanding, Denzel. People don't care about speeches, they care about results. And I delivered. Denzel tilted his head, eyes narrowing with a kind of weary pity. Results? You call division results? You call mocking heroes results? You call turning America into a circus results? You didn't deliver, you dismantled. The crowd exploded again, clapping and stomping their feet. Trump tried to speak over them, but his voice cracked into the roar like a man shouting into a hurricane. The image was unforgettable, one man trembling, shouting for control, while another stood calm, composed, unshaken. And then came the dagger. Denzel leaned into his mic and said slowly, deliberately, "You're not just a failed leader, Donald. You're the biggest embarrassment this office has ever known." The room detonated. Gasps, cheers, even screams filled the air. The camera zoomed in on Trump's face, flushed with rage, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. For once, his words had abandoned him. Trump's face burned crimson under the studio lights. His fists clenched, he slammed the podium so hard the microphone jolted. I made America strong. I rebuilt the military. I gave this country jobs, power, respect. His voice echoed like a desperate plea, but the audience wasn't swayed. Every word felt like an old campaign slogan, recycled and empty. Denzel didn't flinch. He waited, letting Trump's outburst settle into the uneasy silence that followed. Then, he leaned forward, his calm voice cutting like steel. You didn't rebuild America, Donald. You hollowed it out. You gave the illusion of strength while feeding your own ego. You disrespected our veterans, mocked their sacrifices, and when confronted, you doubled down. Gasps rippled across the room. Trump tried to laugh it off, waving dismissively. Fake news, all of it. Lies. They twist my words. But Denzel cut him off with surgical precision. No one twisted your words. They came out of your own mouth. You belittled men who gave their limbs for this country. You ridiculed heroes buried under the flag. And you thought no one would hold you accountable. Well, you're wrong. The crowd erupted, a wave of applause crashing through the studio. The camera caught Trump's lip trembling, his eyes darting between the audience and Denzel as if searching for an escape route. And then Denzel delivered the line that froze the entire broadcast: "A man who disrespects those who bled for this nation doesn't deserve to lead it." You didn't just fail, Donald, you betrayed the very people who trusted you. The studio fell into a stunned hush. Even Trump's usual defenders in the crowd sat still, their applause stuck in their throats. For the first time in years, the former president looked cornered, not by politics, not by opponents, but by truth laid bare in front of millions. Trump opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence was louder than any insult, and it belonged to Denzel. Trump finally tried to regain his footing, his voice cracking as he pointed at Denzel. You think you're some kind of moral authority? You're just an actor. A performer. People like you don't understand what it takes to sit in the Oval Office. You don't know the deals, the pressure, the weight. Denzel didn't move. His stare stayed locked on Trump, calm but unrelenting. Then he spoke, his tone sharper than before, carrying through the studio like a judge delivering a verdict. An actor, he said, shaking his head slowly. I've spent my life telling stories that reveal truths. But this, he gestured around the studio, at the cameras, at Trump himself, this isn't a performance. This is America's reality. And the truth is, you've treated this country like a stage, its people like props, and its veterans like punchlines. The crowd reacted instantly, clapping and shouting in agreement. Trump's jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. For a split second, he seemed smaller under the lights, his usual bravado shrinking as Denzel's words echoed. You call yourself strong? Denzel continued. Strength isn't mocking men who fought for freedom. Strength isn't belittling sacrifice because it doesn't flatter your ego. Strength is respect. Strength is humility. Strength is service to others, not to yourself. Trump tried to cut in, but the audience was already chanting, their voices thundering, respect our vets. Respect our vets. The chant grew so loud that the moderator struggled to restore order. But Denzel raised his hand, and the room fell quiet again. He leaned forward, his voice now steady, almost whispering, yet every syllable carried weight. You've spent years convincing people you're a fighter, Donald. But the truth? You never fought for anyone but yourself. You're not a fighter, you're a fraud. The words landed like a hammer. Trump's shoulders stiffened, his face a mask of forced composure. But the cameras caught it, the twitch at his eye, the falter in his breath, the unmistakable crack in the armor he always wore. The studio wasn't just watching anymore. They were witnessing a collapse. The chaos in the studio was boiling over. Trump slammed his hand on the podium, his face flushed red, sweat glistening under the studio lights. You think you can lecture me, Denzel? You're nothing but an entertainer. People cheer for you in movies, but this is real life. His words came out like a roar, meant to reassert control, but instead they echoed like a man losing ground. Denzel stayed calm, almost unnervingly so. He let Trump's rant spill into the air, then cut through it with a voice so measured it made the room freeze. Real life? In real life, words matter. Respect matters. And when a president mocks the very people who fought for the flag he waves, that's not leadership, that's betrayal. You don't understand sacrifice because you've never made one. Veterans don't need a showman, they need someone who honors their pain. The audience's roar was deafening now, a mix of applause, shouts, and chants of, "Tell the truth." Veterans stood up, saluting Denzel with tears in their eyes, as if his words had carried the weight of every insult they'd endured in silence. Trump shook his head violently, pointing again. "That's not true. I built the strongest military this country's ever had." His voice cracked, and in that moment, the illusion of control shattered. Denzel raised his hand, silencing the noise without shouting, just commanding the room with presence alone. "You built nothing. Soldiers built this nation. Veterans carried it on their backs. And when you stood on a stage and mocked them, you told the world everything it needed to know about who you are. You can't hide from that." The camera caught Trump's face, stiff, defensive, cornered. The audience knew it too. This wasn't just another heated exchange. This was the night Denzel ripped the mask off. The studio had become more than just a stage, it felt like a courtroom, and Trump was the one on trial. Every camera stayed fixed on his face, hoping to capture the unraveling of a man who had spent years projecting strength. His lips pressed tight, eyes darting between the cameras and the audience, looking for an escape. But there was none. Denzel stepped forward, his voice carrying the kind of weight that cut deeper than any insult. "Mr. Trump, you can shout about numbers, about walls, about how great you think you are. But history won't remember the towers you built or the tweets you sent. It will remember that when the people who bled for this nation needed your respect, you laughed at them. That's your legacy." The crowd erupted again, some rising to their feet, clapping in rhythm like they were stamping his words into the air itself. One veteran in the front row yelled, "Finally, someone said it," and the audience responded with cheers that grew like a wave. Trump, visibly rattled, tried to retort, but the words tangled. Fake news. "I never said," his voice cracked, the once dominant figure now shrinking beneath the weight of the moment. Denzel didn't flinch. He delivered the final blow with piercing clarity. "You didn't just disrespect veterans. You disrespected America. And tonight, in front of millions, the truth caught up with you." The camera zoomed out, capturing the standing ovation, the chants of "Denzel. Denzel," echoing through the studio, while Trump stood frozen, cornered by the very silence he used to wield. It wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a reckoning. And the nation had just witnessed it live. Tonight wasn't about politics. It wasn't about left or right. It was about truth. Respect is not optional, it's the foundation of America. And if you can't honor those who gave everything, then you don't deserve to lead. That's the bottom line.